Hello and welcome to this podcast series, Three Irish Women in Indian Nationalism, brought to you by the University of Strathclyde. My name is Lucille, and this is episode 5, Maternal Imperialists or Feminist Allies. Sister Nivedita, Annie Besant and Margaret Cousins all played a part in the Indian feminist cause. Each had a different role in the fight for women's rights in India, and each were engaged in the Indian feminist movement at different stages in its development. Sister Nivedita when Indian women were beginning to discuss age of consent issues and social reform, Annie Besant when only a few Indian women were participating politically, and Margaret Cousins who saw Indian feminism come into its own as more and more women started to fight for their own political and social rights. Therefore, it's important to discuss their individual roles in Indian feminism, as well as the relationship between gender and empire. This episode will focus on the roles of two women, Sister Nivedita and Annie Besant, and the ways in which they are viewed in the Irish press. To hear an account of their lives, check out the earlier podcast episodes. In history, there's been a lot of discussion around the role of white women in the uplift of Indian women. It's quite a contentious issue. Some Western women involved in this struggle have been called maternal imperialists because they upheld the imperial system and reasoned that they were acting for the benefit of their imperial daughters. In other words, they fully supported the civilizing mission of empire and believed that the empire was a positive force for women's rights. Others have been labelled as feminist allies, women who worked for Indian women's rights when Indian women themselves could not, either because they had no access to legislatures or the demands of the Indian nationalist cause were too great. This is when Western women stepped in to help organise campaigns and publicise women's position in India. This meant that as Indian women became more educated and gained more access to the public sphere, these Western women were prepared to let Indian women take control and set the direction of their own movement. The same controversy surrounds these three women's contribution to Indian feminism. Were they maternal imperialists, feminist allies, or somewhere in between? The first woman that we'll be talking about today is Sister Nivedita. She lived in India in the early 1900s when there was no organised Indian feminist movement. Many Indian women were subjugated by strict high-caste Hindu and Muslim cultural and religious practices. Child marriage and widowhood was a common occurrence in India at this time. Some Hindu and Muslim groups also isolated their women away from the rest of society so that they wouldn't fall victim to the male gaze. The practice of purdah caused many Indian women to have to wear a veil or be covered by a curtain, and they could be made to stay in one part of their house called the zenana so that they are away from men. Thus, Indian womanhood was in a difficult position. They held no political power, and for many they were left uneducated, or their formal education ended when they were married at a young age. Although the 1890s and early 1900s did see movements towards social reform. The case of Fulmoni Dasi, a 10-year-old girl who had been brutally raped and killed by her 35-year-old husband, shocked the world. It caused greater interest to be taken in child marriage, particularly by Indian men, but also by some women, including Pandit Ramabai and Rukmabai, who herself had been subjected to an unhappy child marriage and had struggled to free herself from her husband. The calls for reform resulted in the 1891 Child Marriage Act, which pushed the age of consent for girls back from 10 to 12 years old. Like these reformers, Sister Nivedita did what she could to improve Indian women's lives. In 1898, she set up a school in Calcutta for local girls, so that they could learn reading, writing, religion and sewing. In 1903, a women's section was added to the school, so that neighbourhood women could also receive an education. Her work with Indian women can be compared to many of the Christian missionaries of the time. The early 1900s really saw the height of Christian missionary work. Many Western women journeyed to India to set up schools and help the women living in seclusion. The difference was that Sister Nivedita did not try to convert the women she taught to Christianity. While these Christian missionaries were shocked by the subjugation of Indian women, Nivedita actually praised many of these more problematic practices. In her 1904 book, The Web of Indian Life, she tried to explain these Hindu customs to her Western readers, to show that these customs were simply a part of the traditional Indian way of life. This was certainly a controversial approach to take at the time, especially for a Western woman. Overall, the Irish press did not discuss her defence of these strict practices, as they mainly focused on her involvement in Indian nationalism. The only exception was the Irish Unionist paper, The Northern Whig, which opposed her approach in its review of her book. Its writer argues There is too much of the colour of the rose shining on every branch of Indian life she touches. Caste in her hands not only becomes comprehensible, but almost defensible. Child widowhood, which we have been told was a hideous curse, is a beneficent and beautiful institution. The position of the Hindu woman is no longer one of degraded seclusion of slavery, but a pedestal of reverence on which her Western sister never yet has sat. It's understandable why the Northern Whig was critical of her. These Hindu practices did directly contribute to the oppression of Indian women. It's significant too that the Northern Whig was a well-read liberal unionist daily paper which represented middle-class Irish opinion. The middle class in Ireland would have been shocked by the sufferings endured by Indian women, and they would have been outraged that an Irish woman like Sis Nivedita was suggesting that the position of Indian women was superior to that of Western women. In their eyes, middle-class Irish women lived far better lives, ones of domesticity and childcare, while Indian women lived lives of degradation. This is pretty ironic considering that Irish women did not necessarily have it better. Much like some Indian women, middle-class Irish women were secluded very much to their homes. They were not allowed in the areas of business and politics that their husbands occupied, and they did not have more rights than Indian women. Nevertheless, in defending these practices like child marriage and seclusion, Sis Nivedita was going against the grain of middle-class Irish opinion. It is also fascinating how Indian women were painted so differently by the Northern Whig and Sis Nivedita. On the one side, the Northern Whig clearly subscribes to the imperial culture of the time in criticising Nivedita's reverence of Indian women. The writer further goes on to argue that the regeneration to which he looks will never come on the old lines. A dead civilization can no more be resurrected than a dead language or a dead man, and it is well to remember this when speculating on the future of hundreds of millions of human beings. In this, the Northern Whig is suggesting that the position of Indian women is a sign of a dead civilization. In imperial culture, the poor treatment of women in a colony was commonly used to prove that imperial rule was necessary. In late Victorian and Edwardian Britain, there was a lot of emphasis put on what was seen as feminine traits, like purity, nurturing, and moral superiority. In particular, women were portrayed as the moral standard for society. If they were in a supposed degraded position like they were in India, imperialists saw the rest of Indian society as likewise degraded and backward. Thus, the Northern Whig could write off India as a dead civilization which was incapable of self-governing. Sis Nivedita thought very differently about Indian women. She emphasised the moral and spiritual superiority of Indian women and the part that they played in some of the more problematic practices, like child marriage and seclusion. This largely came from her time at the Ramakrishna mission. The Indian guru Swami Vivekananda had instilled in her a respect for Hinduism and Islam, and the women who lived by these philosophies. As he had told her, the uplift of the women, the awakening of the masses, must come first. Then only can any real good come about for the country, for India. Thus Nivedita saw Indian women as the bringers of change in India. In her eyes, they held a real spiritual power, and with this power they could birth a new India. So for both imperialists and Sister Nivedita, the condition of Indian women seemed to have implications for the wider nationalist movement. Sister Nivedita positioned Indian womanhood as the saviours of India, while imperialists framed the position of Indian womanhood as proof that India needed British rule. Therefore, Sister Nivedita's approach to Indian women was certainly unusual for the time. She respected these women's devotion to Hinduism and Islam, unlike many of the Christian missionaries, white feminists, and colonial officials who journeyed to India believing they were saving these helpless women from their religions. In other words, their motivations were imperialist. Their mission was really to civilize the people of India, people who they saw as inherently backward, and this justified continuing British economic, political, and military domination. Many of the white women who journeyed to India as missionaries, feminist campaigners, journalists, and travellers could thus be described as maternal imperialists. On the other hand, Sister Nivedita did not position herself as these women's saviour, but instead wanted to understand the new culture and way of life in which she was living. She wanted to help educate Indian women and preserve the essential Indianness of their traditions, recognising the widespread ill treatment of women in Western societies too. In doing so, she was their feminist ally. As the historian Barbara Ramusak argues, Sister Nivedita managed to successfully collaborate with the Indian women and girls at her school because she saw herself more as their equal rather than as their teacher or civilizer. There was no judgment in how she approached the uplift of Indian women. She did not disparage their religious practices, as the Christian missionaries did. She simply worked to improve their educational opportunities. This was a difficult line to tread. The Western women who journeyed to India couldn't outright condemn the practices that were oppressing Indian women, otherwise they'd be called an imperialist. Nevertheless, they couldn't defend these patriarchal customs either, or else they'd be allowing the subjugation of women to continue, particularly at a time when some Indian women were beginning to contest this. So it was problematic for Sister Nivedita to defend these customs so vehemently, particularly considering the privileged life that she had led. She'd never lived a life of seclusion or been married at a young age, and she was in danger of portraying an essential Indian culture as static and unchanging. Both in India and back in Ireland and England, where she worked as a teacher, Nivedita had lived as an independent woman. Unlike most middle-class women of the time, this kept her firmly in the public sphere and financially independent without the need for a husband. Therefore, Sister Nivedita's position in Indian feminism is complicated. Her privilege prevented her from knowing the true experience of Indian women who enjoyed these strict Hindu and Muslim practices. She assumed that they were contented with their lives, and so she spoke for them, advocating child marriage and seclusion. It was certainly difficult to be an outsider involving yourself in the politics or social issues of another country. This was even more the case when the majority of your countrymen opposed and even undermined your writings and failed to see the nuance of your position. While Sister Nivedita chose to defend some of these more problematic Hindu and Muslim customs, Annie Besant struggled with this decision, ultimately causing her to do little to help in the uplift of Indian women. As a feminist, Besant presents a really interesting case. Annie Besant entered the political scene back in Britain as a part of a second generation of British feminists who had come of age when more interest was being taken in women's rights. In 1866, John Stuart Mill had introduced a bill for women's suffrage in Parliament. It was not passed, but it encouraged a wider struggle to improve British women's educational and employment opportunities, as well as voting and property rights. Amongst these British feminists, Besant was considered a radical. Alongside her secular colleague Charles Bradlaugh, Besant worked to spread a pamphlet called The Fruits of Philosophy, which contained information on natural forms of birth control. It was the first time that such information was made available to working-class people, and caused quite the scandal in Victorian society. The upper classes worried that such information could threaten the health of the nation and the economy. Working-class bodies were needed to maintain the industrial might of the British Empire. They could not risk working-class people deciding to stop having children. Thus, Bradlaugh and Besant were put on trial in 1877 for breaking the Obscene Publications Act, but escaped punishment on a technicality. Besant was already well known due to her separation from her husband in 1873. After her arrest, her husband, the Reverend Frank Besant, tried to get full custody of their daughter because of her supposed immoral actions, causing a media frenzy. The majority of the Irish press supported the Reverend Frank Besant's case. Whether these were unionist, nationalist, or independent papers, they resoundingly condemned Annie Besant's involvement in printing the Fruits of Philosophy pamphlet. While the nationalist paper The Freeman's Journal called this a painful connection for her husband, many of the papers refused to even name the pamphlet. The unionist papers The Court Constitution and the Weekly Irish Times simply referred to the pamphlet as immoral literature or as an obscene publication. The Weekly Irish Times writer further went on to emphasise how obscene the material was by depicting how the pamphlets containing the mother's views were handed to the court and contained statements so dreadful that they were not permitted to be read aloud. Though the independent paper The Meath Herald and Cavan Advertiser gives a more balanced view of Annie Besant's involvement in printing the Fruits of Philosophy pamphlet, but it was the only one that I have found in the archives that has done so. It at least acknowledges that the book which is the subject of the prosecution was, it is said, sold unchallenged for several years. But this was truly the exception. Most of the Irish press was scandalised by some of the charges that Annie Besant made against her husband. She threatened to return and live with her husband if he did not allow her fair custody of her children. She even prayed for a restitution of conjugal rights, meaning that she wanted to resume sexual relations with her husband. This was an outrageous thing to say in court, and for a woman to ask of her husband. According to the feminine ideals of the Victorian era, women were not supposed to take an interest in sex, other than for procreation. Indeed, the nationalist paper The Freeman's Journal was particularly shocked by this, and by the fact that Mrs. Besant was heard in court before her husband. It asked its readers, can any group of circumstances, legal, religious, and social, be imagined more typical of the time we live in than these? A Christian clergyman married to a philosopher of the Free Love School wishes to protect his daughter from influences which he believes to be the most pernicious, and it takes him 5 years of unsuccessful litigation and prayer to get so far that his opponent's prayer should be heard first. So according to much of the Irish press, Annie Besant was morally indefensible. There was little difference between the nationalist, unionist and independent papers in their disapproval of Mrs. Besant. This is because along religious lines, both Irish Protestants and Catholics opposed birth control and divorce. So the Irish people of all social classes were pretty united in their condemnation of Annie Besant. Likewise, these scandals had alienated the more conservative British feminists at the time. While they focused on improving women's educational and work opportunities, her feminist activities took her on to empower female sexuality and spread information on contraception. Amongst these middle and upper-class Christian feminists, and as we have seen amongst Irish people too, Annie Besant's approach to women's rights was radical. However, by the time she got to India, Annie Besant had renounced some of this radicalism. The historian Nancy Paxton puts this down to her conversion to Theosophy. As you've already heard, Theosophy mixed elements of Western occultism, Hinduism and Buddhism, and taught that there was a universal ancient religion which formed the basis for all major world religions. The founder of Theosophy, Helena Blavatsky, encouraged Besant to give up her support for birth control and her empowerment of women's sexuality in the 1890s. Blavatsky taught that humans would eventually become higher spiritual beings who have no need for sex apart from for procreation. Thus, her theosophical beliefs caused Besant to take a more moderate path in Indian feminism. In her early years in India, Besant idolized Hindu women and Indian society as a whole as spiritually superior to Western culture, causing her to romanticize and defend many of the patriarchal institutions. She stressed Indian women's domestic role, argued that women living in Purdah were contented, and supported the Hindu law banning widows remarrying. This seems pretty bizarre, considering that Besant herself had been deeply unhappy with her domestic role and divorced her husband to free herself from these bonds. The ban on widows remarrying also seems a strange practice to defend. Child widows, often young girls whose husbands had died before they had cohabited, suffered a lot in Indian society. They were at the mercy of their husband's family and could be made to serve his family for the rest of their lives, or could even be put out on the streets. Clearly her defence of these Hindu customs did not help the Indian feminist cause. It actually went some way in hindering it. Indian social reformers at the time were trying to rid Indian society of these deprivations. In the 1850s, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar had campaigned to allow widows to remarry and to stop widow abuse, resulting in the passing of the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act in 1856. In spite of this, Indian social reformers still struggled to implement this law in the 20th century. Women could still be ostracized and abused if they chose to remarry. Therefore, Annie Besant's praise of these customs did not help promote social reform, but actually promoted the retention of these practices. Though this may have been part of Annie Besant's plan, certainly the historian Nancy Anderson thinks so. She argues that this was Besant trying to assimilate herself into Indian society and the Indian nationalist movement. Besant was simply biding her time until she gained support from enough Indians and could then reveal her more radical beliefs on women's rights. There's evidently some truth in this. After defending many of these practices, Annie Besant only set out her strategy for social reform in a series of lectures in 1913. She called for an end to child marriage, an end to the exclusion of Indian women, and better education for women. In response, some Orthodox Hindus called her an imperialist, as they believed that she was trying to westernize Indian culture. As Nancy Anderson argues, she was definitely treading a difficult line between colonizer and colonized. Besant had to be accepted by the Indian people before she could put forward any program for social reform. Although she only went some way in addressing these reforms herself when she founded the Women's Indian Association alongside Margaret Cousins in 1917. This association fought to improve women's education and to end child marriage, yet it appears that this was more Margaret Cousins' organisation than Besant's. Annie Besant agreed to serve as its president, but much of her time was devoted to the Indian nationalist cause and the Home Rule movement, rather than the struggle for women's rights. She does seem to be more of a high-profile figurehead than an active leader. We can see in the Irish press how much emphasis is put on her involvement in Indian nationalism. They discussed her Home Rule agitation, her internment, and her presidency of the Indian National Congress, but no articles appear in the archives about her contribution to Indian feminism. Ultimately, it appears that when women's rights and political rights for Indians came into conflict, Home Rule won out. For example, when Margaret Cousins, Sarojini Naidu, and other members of the Women's Indian Association pressed Besant to add female suffrage to her Home Rule campaign, she refused. She knew that she would lose support from Orthodox Hindus if she added this to her movement, so ultimately her commitment to building a broad coalition for Indian nationalism was more important. Besant further took a backseat when members of the Women's Indian Association lobbied the British government in India to include female suffrage in its 1919 constitutional reforms. In the end, the British left this decision up to the provincial governments, angering many members of the Women's Indian Association, particularly as propertied women in Britain had already been granted the vote in 1918. Yet Annie Besant did not share this anger. As the London Dairy Sentinel notes, a manifesto signed by the Indian Progressive Party, including the moderates, Mrs. Annie Besant and others, says that the signatories support the Montagu-Chelmsford scheme of reforms as being a distinct advance on existing conditions. Clearly, Besant was focused on how these reforms would impact the Indian nationalist cause, not the struggle for women's suffrage. These reforms allowed some Indian men to vote for the first time, and for Indians to have seats in provincial councils, opening up the possibility for full self-government for India in the future. Thus, Besant saw this as a step in the right direction, even if these reforms did not include female suffrage, and even though the reforms were rejected by many Indian nationalists as too moderate. Of course, we can understand why Besant prioritised political nationalism over political and social rights for Indian women, given the limited power that even Indian men had in their political system. But it does seem to show a double standard. She had been a radical feminist in the 1880s, advocating greater freedom in women's sexuality. As the British feminist movement moved into a new phase in the 1900s with the suffragette campaign, Besant supported her fellow feminists from India, even if she did not approve of their militancy. Yet Besant did not support female suffrage in India. In this, she was complicit with the imperial system. The British government did not want to enfranchise Indian women or enact policies that would help uplift Indian womanhood. Annie Besant refused to put pressure on the British to do this. The situation in Ireland is also interesting for understanding Besant's limited role in Indian feminism. In the 1910s, the feminist movement in Ireland was very much tied to Irish nationalism, under the leadership of Hannah Skeffington, one of the founders of the Irish Women's Franchise League alongside Margaret Cousins. Skeffington helped the revolutionaries in the 1916 Easter Rising, and after her husband Francis Skeffington was shot dead by the British during the Rising, she aligned herself and the Irish Women's Franchise League more firmly with Sinn Féin, campaigning for both women's rights and independence for Ireland. This may explain why there is so little comment in the Irish press about Annie Besant's limited role in Indian feminism. From the Unionist side, this seemed to reflect many Unionist ambivalence towards women's rights, but on the Nationalist side, perhaps it shows an understanding for what Besant was trying to do in India. In prioritising nationalism over feminism, Besant was following the Irish example, as many Irish nationalist feminists fought for independence over female suffrage. The nationalist cause took priority, and so her Home Rule League was discussed extensively in the nationalist press, while they refrained from criticising her neglect of women's rights. Perhaps it also reflected her complicated position as a woman in a man's world. Some of the Irish press have emphasised her unusual position. For instance, the Derry Journal ran an article about her Home Rule League with the headline, "Lady Agitator in India." The Freeman's Journal, too, wrote of the exceptional position she held as the president of the Indian National Congress. The article depicts how amongst 4,000 delegates, Mrs. Besant was moved to the chair of acclamation. The silver-haired lady, amidst an ovation, mounted the rostrum and delivered a lengthy presidential address supporting the National Congress and Muslim League reform upon Mrs. Besant's own Home Rule lines. The majority of these 4,000 delegates would have been Indian men, yet they chose a silver-haired lady to be their president. The fact that the Freeman's Journal called her a silver-haired lady is interesting. The writer is suggesting that her gender and age make her an unusual choice for a president, as these would have normally excluded her from such a position. Therefore, in such a male-dominated environment, Annie Besant was under some pressure to meet these male delegates' expectations. Many of them would not have supported her if she'd used her platform to campaign for female suffrage, though as she ascended to become president of the Indian National Congress, she could have done more to bring Indian women up with her into the political arena. For this reason, she can hardly be described as a feminist ally to Indian women. In the next episode, we'll continue our discussion on the role of Margaret Cousins in Indian feminism.